Welcome to APUSH Nation. Today we're going to be talking about NAFTA, the Bosnian conflict, and the Somalian conflict. Now, before we get into NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, we must mention that before NAFTA was passed, President Ronald Reagan permitted the passage of the Trade and Tariffs Act of 1984. This gave the President authority to fast-track trade agreements as well as make amendments to the trade remedy and reciprocity laws.
Hey, Carlos, what's up, man?
My favorite Prime Minister, Brian. Ready to talk about some trade today?
You know it, eh?
Hey.
What was good? My fellow nations, I'm America. My name is Bill Clinton, and we're going to be talking about what my predecessor, George H.W. Bush, called NAFTA. Now, NAFTA cannot be possible without my homie from Mexico, Mr. Silva, and my homie from Canada, Mr. Mulroney. It's gonna be #lit. Alrighty, folks. Today, first we're gonna discuss what happened with my buddy Canada. Dude, you're just such a good neighbor. You don't even notice you're there half the time. So, did you know that in 1988 we came up with the Free Trade Agreement?
Yeah, I know, I was there.
You were there.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. We rule the world. We're the only ones that were supposed to be there, alright? Even though this was an agreement. Now, let me explain to you, APUSH Nation, some of the stipulations of this agreement. First, as stated in our agreement, we eliminate barriers to trading goods and services between Canada and the United States, so we're eliminating barriers, as I just said. Second, facilitate the conditions of fair competition between our great nations. The third thing is to significantly liberalize conditions for investment. The fourth thing is establish effective procedures for the joint admin of the agreement. Make sure we're both working together on it. And the fifth and final thing was to lay the foundation for further agreements, which would then include NAFTA, which is what we're going to talk about later. Now, for my bro Chancho Mexico, we got something special in store for that. So basically what happened, my predecessor, George H.W. Bush, he began negotiation with Mr. Salinas, and he wanted a liberalized trade agreement between Mexico and the U.S., because Mexican tariffs on U.S. imports were 250% higher than U.S. tariffs on Mexican imports. Now, in 1992, George H.W. Bush proposed NAFTA into action, which would include both these dudes and basically our side of the world in a massive trade agreement. So now Bill Clinton signed it into law, and Bill Clinton, signed it into law in 1993. Now, the purpose of the NAFTA agreement has 7 specific bullets to them. One is to grant you guys the most favored nation status, and what that basically means is you guys have the best top-notch trade rights. It's kind of like you guys are flying first class in terms of our trade rights to you. Number 2 was to eliminate all of our barriers to trade and facilitate the cross-border movements of goods and services. That means no barriers getting to Canada, no barriers getting to Mexico. And of course, the third thing is, it's all done within the realm of fair competition. The fourth also is to increase investment opportunities. Basically, when we want to invest in nations, you guys will be our first target because we really want to invest with y'all. The fifth is to provide protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights. The sixth is to create procedures for the resolutions of any trade disputes we might have. And the seventh is to establish trade work for future nations. I hope you guys agree with this. Are y'all good with this? Get the trade with Powerhouse America. Are you guys ready? Let's go on this journey together. Thank you very much.
Despite the agreements that NAFTA boasted, it remains a topic of discussion in the U.S. One of its biggest opponents was Ross Perot, an independent party candidate that rose to prominence in the 1992 election. He was very vocal about his vehement opposition to NAFTA, predicting it would give too many jobs to low-cost Mexican workers. It also entered public affairs this past election cycle, as Donald Trump promised his voters that he would fight to get rid of it entirely.
Hello, APUSH Nation. Another topic we will be discussing on this fabulous fireside chat will be the conflict in Bosnia. Now, since 90% of you probably don't know where Bosnia is, we're going to put a photo in right here. In 1991, the Yugoslavian communist government fell, and this caused a lot of constituent states to form out of Yugoslavia. The 6 constituent states included Bosnia, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. And Yugoslavia was a country, and all of these constituent countries were divided among ethnic lines. The Yugoslavian People's Government, or JNA, sought to keep the whole entire Yugoslavian country just as it was. They wanted to keep it together. But the nationality that ultimately came above the rest was the Serbians, because of the leader Slobodan Milosevic, who came into power during this time. Now, since this was the first huge conflict in Europe after World War II, and the United Nations saw this as a threat because there were a lot of lives and towns, and a lot of things were being lost. So they passed an arms embargo, and this arms embargo is initialed as FRY, and this is Security Council Resolution 713, which said there will be no delivering of military equipment into the whole entire Yugoslavian nation. In 1992, the main theater of conflict in the whole entire Yugoslav war was in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and as I just mentioned, Slobodan Milosevic, the prime minister who brought up the Serbian nationalist ideas, really targeted Bosnia as his area to attack and get those Serbian ideals in there. Now, the population of Bosnia and Herzegovina happened to be primarily Muslim, so there was a lot of racism against them, and what happened is they tried to kill all of them, and this is kind of like genocide, or what is well known in all the history books as ethnic cleansing. Now, in 1993, the UN passed the Vance-Owen Peace Plan, or the Sarajevo Plan, Saravejo, and this was basically said that the UN will back Bosnia if they break into 10 separate regions. Back in the USA, George H.W. Bush sought to keep the whole conflict in Europe, wanted nothing to do with it, but Bill Clinton, when he was running for president, said that they should have a lift and strike policy. The U.S. should have a lift and strike policy towards the Bosnians. And this basically said, let's lift the arms embargo, but let's put airstrikes in the Bosnian area so we can combat the fighting.
Nation. So, about the Bosnian conflict, under President Clinton, there was little support from the Department of Defense and public alike for the intervention of the Balkans. When the Serbs attacked the Srebrenica safe zone, air support was authorized to support the United Nations Protection Force, or UNPRO-4 for short. Bosnian Serbs forces led an offensive against Gorizad, a city in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and killed UNPRO-4 soldiers, which caused NATO to launch an airstrike, to which the Bosnian Serbs responded by threatening to kill more soldiers, including UNPRO-4 soldiers. So the U.S. created a contact group to spearhead policy, and the contact group agreed on a set of guidelines for a peace settlement. So, 1. Bosnia would remain a single state comprised of Muslim Croat Federation and a Serb entity, and these entities would be linked by constitutionally agreed principles. And 2. The contact group agreed on a map of Bosnia-Herzegovina where Muslim Croat Federation controlled 51% of the territory, and the Serbian entity controlled 49%. So, when the Bosnian Croats and Muslim groups signed a ceasefire, they rejected the above guidelines, and the Serbia cut off support to Bosnian Serb forces while Croatian and Bosnian Muslim forces built up via increasingly porous arms embargo. Former President Jimmy Carter then negotiated a 4-month peace truce. In 1995, combat restarted with Muslim and Croatian forces on the offensive in western Bosnia-Herzegovina. Bosnian Serb troops retook UN-secured weapons and brushed aside UNPRO-4 soldiers, eliciting an airstrike by NATO, to which the Bosnian Serbs responded by taking UNPRO-4 troops hostage and using them as human shields. NATO deployed a combat-ready rapid reaction force to Bosnia to reduce the vulnerability of widely scattered UNPRO-4 units. In July, the Bosnian Serbs massacred over 7,000 men in Srebrenica. This served as a tipping point for the West to make a decision on how to resolve the conflict. NATO agreed on the dual key policy for controlling airstrikes, and NATO agreed that future attacks on safe areas would result in an airstrike. On August 1st, Croatian and Bosnian forces led a powerful offensive called Operation Storm against Bosnia Serb-held territory in western Bosnia. This displaced thousands of Serb refugees and shifted the 51-49 territorial balance the contact group had earlier established. Assistant Secretary of State for Western Europe, Richard Holbrooke, negotiated a settlement for a ceasefire. When a mortar shell exploded on August 25th, NATO began Operation Deliberate Force, which was an intense two-week military attack on Serb military positions. The parties reached a hard-fought agreement on November 21st, and the Dayton Accords, formerly the General Framework Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, were signed in Paris on December 14th. Shortly after, the NATO-led Implementation Force, IFOR, was deployed into Bosnia-Herzegovina. In 1999, Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic launched a vicious campaign of ethnic cleansing to purge Kosovo of the Albanians living there. The U.S. and NATO launched a successful aerial assault on Serbia, and an agreement was reached, so Kosovo was placed under UN supervision with NATO troops acting as peacekeepers.
Next, we're going to be talking about the Somali Civil War. To give some background, in July of 1960, Somalia gained independence, and the U.S. quickly started to set up diplomatic relations with them. At first, Somalia was divided into two Somalilands, the British Somaliland in the north and the Italian Somaliland in the south. However, we must mention that there was a French Somaliland that was north of the British Somaliland. This actually, though, became a country of its own. The power was peacefully transferred to the well-developed Somali political culture. Despite this promising start, there were significant problems, especially with the north-south economic divide. In the early 1960s, the north half of Somalia began to reject referendums that had won majority votes and began to advocate secession from Somalia as a whole. Finally, in 1969, the Somali army launched a coup d'etat which brought Mohammed Siad Barre to power and in turn created a socialist government. He called this type of government a scientific socialist government. It combined aspects of the Quran with influences of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, Mao Zedong, and Benito Mussolini. However, he felt that socialism was not a religion. It is a political principle to organize government and manage production. Under Barre, he favored members of his own clan, using nepotism as a political strategy. For synthesis, this could be compared to the use of cronyism in the Grant era, when he appointed many friends to positions in his government. Barre was increasingly radical in foreign affairs. In 1977, he began a war against Ethiopia to try and take over their territory. Ethiopia received help from the USSR, therefore the United States began to back Somalia.
Eventually, opposition began to rise against Barre, and his rule couldn't combat it. Groups of rebels unified and drove him from Mogadishu in 1991. No new group came to power, and the U.S. closed its embassy there, but the U.S. still kept its diplomatic relations with Somalia. Then, chaos and humanitarian crisis began. To address this chaos, the UN created the United Nations Operation Somalia, also known as UNISOM, to provide humanitarian aid under the Resolution 751 in April of 1992. Later that year, the U.S. launched Operation Provide Comfort to send food, though the delivery to many people who needed it the most was delayed due to fighting between warlords, one of whom was Mohammed Farah Aidid, who we will mention later. The U.S. then launched Operation Restore Hope, where President H.W. Bush authorized U.S. troops to go to Somalia to help with famine relief as part of the larger UN relief effort. The UN United Task Force, also known as UNITAF, was implemented under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which allowed force to maintain peace, whether the involved states consented or not. UNITAF then transitioned to UNISOM II, whose efforts to protect the delivery of aid was protested by warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid. On October 3, 1993, Aidid's forces shot down 2 Black Hawk helicopters, which in turn caused 18 American soldiers' deaths, as well as that of hundreds of Somalis, which led to more support for the U.S. effort. President Clinton pulled U.S. troops out days later, and the UN withdrew a year later. However, conflict persisted in Somalia. Simultaneously with the crisis, the national bureaucracy reconsidered how the U.S. should become involved in peacekeeping situations, as ordered by President Clinton. This led to the Presidential Decision Directive 25, issued on May 3, 1994. This outlined 8 factors that must be considered before supporting UN peacekeeping efforts, and 9 more before supporting Chapter 7 action, which, again, was the use of force to maintain peace without the consent of involved states. The U.S. remained engaged in responding to the humanitarian needs of the Somali people and continued to be a significant source of aid.